The night was suffocating. The house smelled of gun oil, damp concrete, and the acrid smoke of cigarettes that had burned down to their filters. I sat in a corner, my back pressed against the peeling wall, a pistol heavy in my palm. Outside, the storm of whispers carried rumors of betrayal, my betrayal. The cartel had decided someone was leaking information, and the circle of suspicion had closed around my team. Through the window slits, I could see shadows shifting in the alley. They weren't police. They weren't soldiers. They were my own people, sicarios like me, waiting for the word to break in and drag me to interrogation. In the language of the cartel, interrogation meant you would either confess or you would die. Sometimes both. I tried to steady my breathing, but each inhale tasted of fear. My finger traced the grooves of the gun's grip slick with sweat. I had lived with a weapon in my hand for years, but tonight it felt heavier than ever before, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. Survival or confession. Life or silence. And then the memories returned uninvited. Carla, my little sister. 15 years old, too young to understand that love in our world was never innocent. Her body had been found broken, mutilated, branded with a mark that wasn't ours. The Zetas had carved their signature into her flesh and into my life. That was the night I stopped being invisible. That was the night vengeance began to feel like destiny. I tightened my grip on the pistol and closed my eyes. For 8 years I had been part of an empire that most people only knew through newspapers or Netflix series. They thought they understood the story Mayo Zambada, the kingpin, the untouchable lord of Sinaloa. To the outside world, he was the face of the Pacific Cartel, the one who pulled the strings, the man who decided who lived and who died. But I had seen the truth. El Mayo was never the true boss. What the world never understood was that the power of the cartel did not sit on one man's shoulders. It was divided, hidden, managed by people who would never appear on any most wanted list. They wore no crowns, commanded no armies in public, and yet their decisions shaped the war that tore Mexico apart. I was there. I watched them argue over money, over routes, over blood. I carried their messages, their money, their orders. I saw faces that even the DEA never suspected, and I learned that behind every visible king stood an invisible council. Now trapped in this house with death waiting outside, I know the truth has to be told. If they break in tonight, they will silence me forever. But if I speak now, you will understand what few ever dared to imagine. You think El Mayo was the head, I will tell you who really held the power. I was born into dust and hunger. The streets of Culiacan were not paved with opportunity. They were carved with desperation. In the neighborhood of Estase, water came once a week if we were lucky. Electricity flickered like a taunt, reminding us of what we lacked. My mother scrubbed the marble floors of wealthy houses while I carried sacks of beans and rice in the local market for 150 pesos a day. That was our dignity, the kind that barely kept tortillas on the table. But dignity doesn't shield you from violence. Poverty doesn't protect you from predators. And in Sinaloa, predators were everywhere. The cartel was not just a shadow on the corner. It was the air we breathed. Men in white shirts and crocodile boots rolled through our streets in shiny trucks, and we knew they had the power to decide who was safe and who was marked. Carla was 15, too young to understand that money and danger are twins in our world. She came home once with new clothes, once with a phone none of us could afford, once with lipstick that smelled like a perfume shop we could never enter. I knew the source. A young man in a white Jetta who handed out pesos like candy. I warned her. I begged her. But love, when it comes wrapped in gifts, is deaf to warnings. The night she didn't return, silence fell heavy in our house. My mother stayed awake by the door, rocking in her chair, whispering prayers that crumbled into sobs. 3 days later, we found Carla. A patch of dirt near the river, her small body beaten, her fingers cut away, a letter carved into her back with a knife. Not our cartel's mark. It was the Zetas. They had begun their push into Sinaloa, and my sister was collateral in a war she never understood. The coffin we could afford was thin, cheap wood that creaked when lowered into the earth. My mother clung to it, her tears falling on splinters. I remember standing there, my fists clenched so hard my nails cut my palms, knowing that the world had stolen something from us and left nothing in return. That was when he approached me. El Checo. He didn't look like the flamboyant bosses that made headlines. No gold chains, no noisy entourage. Just a white dress shirt tucked into jeans, crocodile boots, and a face I had seen around the neighborhood. He placed his hand on my shoulder as if we were old friends. "I'm sorry for your sister, Moro," he said softly. His voice carried no pity, only certainty. "If you don't want this to stay the way it is, meet me tomorrow. Taqueria El Güero, 2 in the afternoon." He didn't wait for my answer. He didn't need to. He knew grief has only 2 outcomes: submission or retaliation. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind burned with images of Carla, of my mother's broken cries, of the carved mark on her back. Rage and helplessness battled inside me until the sun rose. I knew that if I went to that taqueria, my life would change forever. But I also knew that if I didn't, Carla's death would remain unpunished, and my family would always be prey in a neighborhood where the Zetas had already planted their flag. At 2 o'clock the next day, I walked into the taqueria. The taqueria smelled of grilled meat and cilantro, but for me the air was thick with something heavier fate. I stepped inside and found El Checo in the back, seated with 2 men I had never seen before. They weren't talking. They were measuring me, their silence louder than any threat. One was broad-shouldered, his skin dark, a scar cutting across his left cheek like a permanent sneer. The other was slim, wearing sunglasses even indoors, his expression unreadable behind the glass. They looked less like men eating tacos and more like judges awaiting a verdict. My verdict. "Sit down," Mayo Checo said, motioning to the empty chair across from him. I sat, my heart beating so hard I wondered if they could hear it. Checo leaned forward, his voice steady. "Do you want vengeance, or do you want justice?" I didn't understand the difference then. In my head they were the same thing. "I want them to pay," I answered. The scarred man smirked. "Vengeance is personal. Justice is business. If you come with us, you'll get both, but you'll also take on responsibilities bigger than your pain." That was the first lesson. The cartel was never about one life, one wound. It was a system, a machine, and once you entered, your grief became fuel for something much larger. Checo explained the choices. There are 3 ways to begin. You can work as a halcon eyes on the street. You can be a barrero carrying loads across the border. Or, he paused, letting the silence settle, you can join seguridad. That means training, weapons, money, and the duty to solve problems when they come. It also means you'll never leave clean. The man with sunglasses spoke for the first time. His tone was cold, final. "Even if you live long enough to retire, the family will always remember you. You belong to us." I should have hesitated. I should have thought of my mother, of the weight of that coffin. But hesitation felt like weakness, and weakness had already cost Carla her life. I looked Checo in the eyes and said, "I want seguridad." No one smiled. No one congratulated me. They just nodded as if confirming a piece of paperwork. And in that moment, I ceased to be the boy who carried sacks in the market. I became property of the cartel. When I stepped out of the taqueria, the sunlight felt different, harsher, as though the world itself knew I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The street noises, the chatter of vendors, the laughter of children, it all sounded distant, muffled, like I was already living in another reality. That afternoon, I didn't tell my mother where I had been. I didn't tell her about the deal sealed over tacos and silence. All I told myself was that I was doing this for Carla, for her justice, for her memory. But deep down, another truth whispered. I was tired of being invisible. I wanted power, even if it was borrowed, even if it was paid for with blood. 3 days later, a truck came for me. The ride out of Culiacan was quiet. None of us spoke, but every man inside knew what it meant. We weren't boys anymore. We were recruits on the road to something darker, sharper, and far more permanent. The ranch lay beyond the city lights, hidden among fields of dust and mesquite trees. From the outside it looked ordinary, a cluster of tin-roofed barns and broken fences. But once the gates closed behind us, the illusion disappeared. This was no farm. It was a crucible designed to melt away whatever innocence we still carried. The first night we were lined up in a dirt courtyard under a sky full of stars that offered no comfort. An older man with a soldier's posture walked the line, his boots crunching gravel. He introduced himself only as El Sargento. His eyes were knives cutting each of us open without words. You are here because you want to stop being weak, he said. But weakness doesn't die easily. It must be beaten, starved, and burned out of you. For the next weeks, our lives became a blur of drills, weapons, and discipline that bordered on torture. Dawn meant running until our lungs tore. Mornings meant stripping and assembling rifles until our fingers bled. Afternoons were for target practice, ambush simulations, and endless lectures about codes of silence. Nights were spent half sleeping with rifles across our chests, ears tuned for the bark of an order or the crack of gunfire staged to test our reflexes. The code was simple, but merciless: loyalty above all obedience, without hesitation, betrayal punished by death. They told us this not with threats, but with demonstrations. One evening, they dragged a man into the courtyard, an ex-member who had stolen money. They didn't shout. They didn't rage. They simply shot him in front of us, then ordered us to bury him by lantern light. The silence of that burial weighed more than the gunshot itself, but the most shattering moment came with the first junta. I had expected a spectacle: El Mayo arriving with convoys of armored trucks, surrounded by dozens of gunmen. Instead, 5 ordinary vehicles rolled up, a couple of old Surus, a Cheyenne, with peeling paint, even a yellow taxi. Out stepped men who looked like schoolteachers, ranchers, office clerks, and among them a woman in her 50s wearing a simple dress, driving herself without escort. I whispered to El Flaco, a veteran recruit beside me. "These are the bosses." He nodded. "These are the real ones, the men you see on the news, the names on the posters, they're only spokesmen. The power lives here in these faces no one recognizes." The woman was introduced as Esperanza, though everyone called her La Contadora. She handled sums larger than the national budget, yet she arrived like a schoolteacher with chalk dust on her hands. Don Rafa, a rancher with mud still on his boots, spoke of opium fields and mountain routes. A man called El Ingeniero, polished, educated, presented strategies for investments in hotels and pharmacies. And then there was El Padrino, a police commander who came in full uniform, the badge on his chest a shield for the entire council. That night, the veil fell away. I realized the cartel was not ruled by one king, but by a boardroom of invisible directors. El Mayo was a figurehead, a shield absorbing the bullets of attention, while these hidden operators maneuvered in silence. By the time we were dismissed, my understanding of power had changed forever. I had entered training seeking vengeance for Carla. I left that junta knowing vengeance was just a spark, and I was now a cog in a machine fueled by money, politics, and shadows. It was January of 2010 when I was ordered to ride along on a job. They told me I wasn't there to pull the trigger, only to observe and learn. That was how they phrased it, aprender cómo se hacen las cosas bien. Learn how things are done properly. The target was a man named only as El Contador, an accountant for the Beltran Leyva organization, who had been leaking financial details to the authorities. He was no sicario, no soldier, just a middle-aged man with glasses, a mustache, and the kind of ordinary face you could pass 100 times in the street and never remember. But in the eyes of the cartel, information was more dangerous than bullets, and betrayal demanded precision. We tracked him to a seafood restaurant in Mazatlan. The place was crowded with families, children slurping sodas, waiters balancing trays of oysters and shrimp. Our target sat at a corner table with his wife and 2 young daughters. He laughed at something one of the girls said, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. For a moment, he looked like any other father. For a moment, I almost believed this wouldn't happen in front of them. But rules were rules. Mercy wasn't part of the vocabulary. We waited until his family stepped outside toward the car. Then El Moreno, the scar-faced veteran leading the job, pressed the barrel of a pistol to the back of the accountant's neck. "Tienes algo que decir?" he asked, calm, almost casual. The man began to sob. "Please, I have children. They're just little girls." El Moreno's eyes didn't change. "You should have thought of that before you opened your mouth." 2 shots cracked, muffled by the hum of traffic. The man's body slumped over the half-eaten plate of ceviche. I stood at the door, frozen ears ringing, not from the gunfire, but from the sudden collapse of the illusion that there were limits. The restaurant buzzed with panic chairs, scraping, people shouting. But for us, it was routine. We walked out calmly, blending into the chaos like smoke fading into the wind. 5 minutes later, we sat at a taqueria, the same kind where I had sold my soul months earlier. El Moreno bit into a taco and wiped salsa from his chin. "The first time always hits hard," he said between mouthfuls. "But you'll see. After a while, it's just work. Just work." That phrase clanged inside my head like a cruel bell. I tried to believe it. I told myself this wasn't murder. It was business justice, the price of survival. But the truth was simpler, it was killing. And I had stood guard for it. In the weeks that followed, more jobs came. Some were stakeouts, others deliveries, but soon I was included in operations where the line between observing and participating blurred. The first time they handed me a weapon and told me to finish it, I hesitated only a second before pulling the trigger. The recoil shook my arm, but it was my soul that trembled. At night, I convinced myself that each body dropped was one less threat to my family, one more step toward balance after Carla's death. But even then, part of me knew the truth. Vengeance had already been replaced. What I was doing had nothing to do with her anymore. It was about power, fear, and the strange intoxication of not being invisible. That was the first lie I told myself. And once you tell one, the rest come easy. By the time my second year in the cartel began, I was no longer the boy who had carried sacks in the market. I had become something else. An instrument sharpened by routine violence, a messenger trusted with secrets heavy enough to crush me. The job they gave me was called mensajería especial, but it was nothing like delivering letters. It meant carrying coded orders, sealed envelopes of cash, or sometimes the kind of passengers who never traveled by airline. On the surface, it sounded harmless. In truth, it was the artery of the organization. Every note I carried, every name I whispered across a table could decide which routes stayed open, which politicians stayed bought, which rivals stayed alive. To be chosen was both an honor and a curse. Through this role, I was pulled closer to the circle of the invisible. I saw La Contadora arrive at meetings with a yellow taxi, no bodyguards, her hair tied back like a schoolteacher. Yet the ledgers in her handbag contained more power than any rifle. I delivered documents that confirmed which bank accounts would be moved, which hotels would be purchased, which politicians would suddenly find campaign funds swelling like rivers in flood. I also saw Don Rafa, the rancher, whose empire smelled of dirt and diesel. He never traveled without 3 pit bulls pacing around him, but his real power was the network of campesinos who planted opium in the mountains. I carried his instructions to chemists in hidden labs where powder turned into fortune. And then there was El Ingeniero. Polished suits, manicured hands, the kind of man you'd mistake for a corporate lawyer. He was building something new. Systems of laundering money through shell companies, international transfers, even whispers of cryptocurrencies. I didn't understand half of it, but I understood the results. Profits multiplied. The council listened when he spoke, even when their faces betrayed suspicion. El Padrino was different. He didn't bother to hide. He arrived in his police uniform, shaking hands with soldiers, smiling for cameras at official events, then attending secret juntas at night. My deliveries for him were never papers or money. They were warnings. Which raids would happen, which investigations would vanish, which agents were already on the payroll. He was the invisible armor of the cartel, and I was one of the veins carrying his protection into the bloodstream of corruption. Through these tasks, my status grew. I was given more men under me, small teams, who shadowed my movements, armed escorts that once would have terrified me. Now they bowed their heads and called me patron. The money increased too, thousands each month, enough to buy clothes my mother would never dare touch, in a store enough to move my family into a safer house. But with each step upward came shadows heavier than the wealth. I attended meetings where men disappeared after speaking too boldly. I saw drivers shot for misplacing a delivery. And always there was the unspoken truth: the higher you rose, the more dangerous the fall. One evening in Mazatlan, I sat in a hotel suite overlooking the ocean. Waves crashed against the shore, tourists laughed in the streets below, and inside the room, La Contadora and Don Rafa argued over whether to buy another chain of pharmacies or expand cultivation in the Sierra. Their voices rose, but I realized the brilliance of it all. They weren't criminals screaming in alleys. They were directors in a boardroom, shaping markets like multinational CEOs. That night, I finally understood what I had become part of. Not a gang, not even a cartel. A corporation built from blood and fear, managed by people the world would never see. And I, once invisible, was now a rising functionary in its shadows. Inside the cartel, life was a paradox. By day, we lived like kings. By night, we survived like prisoners. The same hand that poured champagne at a party could point a gun at you the next morning. That was the machinery, relentless, unpredictable, yet precise as a clock. There were rules. They were not written, but they were carved into us with fear. Never speak of names outside the circle. Never question an order, even when it contradicts the last. Never touch what does not belong to you, whether it is money, merchandise, or a woman connected to another man. And above all, silence. Silence was the oxygen of the organization. Break it, and you suffocated. I saw what happened to those who forgot. A driver once spoke too freely after a few beers, bragging to a cousin about the convoys he escorted. 2 days later, we were ordered to attend a lesson. His body was dragged into the warehouse, beaten beyond recognition. They made us watch as his tongue was cut out before the final bullet ended it. No one spoke a word during the execution. We all understood silence wasn't optional, it was survival. Yet beyond the brutality, there was opulence. I attended parties where money was burned on champagne towers, where women in sequined dresses danced beside pools lit with neon lights, where narco corridos blasted so loudly the walls shook. Politicians arrived in discreet convoys, lawyers toasted with us, and police officers guarded the gates like hired staff. For a few hours, it felt like the entire country belonged to us. But in the morning, the hangover was more than alcohol. It was the reminder that luxury was never free. I returned to safe houses with walls stained from interrogations where men screamed into gags as their bodies were broken piece by piece. I learned that torture wasn't chaos, it was a profession. Food rationed to control the mind, beatings measured to avoid permanent damage until the right moment. Information was extracted not through rage, but through cold calculation. It was there I met La Nena, a captured accountant from the Zetas. She resisted for 12 days, enduring everything we threw at her. She did not break until we threatened her daughter. When she finally gave us the accounts, the names, the houses, she had nothing left inside her eyes. That night, the doctor ordered me to pull the trigger. I protested she had cooperated. He simply answered, "That's exactly why she's useless now." I obeyed, but the vomit came later, violent, uncontrollable. Not from the act itself, but from realizing how easily life was discarded once its value expired. Among us, trust was an illusion. Even friendship was fragile. I had one El Guero Palma, a man who once saved me during a botched delivery. He laughed easily, spoke of dreams beyond the life. But when he fell in love with the wrong woman, the wife of a regional commander, he was summoned to a meeting. He never returned. I carried the message to his mother, lying that he had gone to the United States for work. She died years later, still waiting for his return. That lie haunts me more than his death. The longer I stayed, the more I learned to disconnect, to separate the person who killed from the person who smiled at his mother on Sunday visits. Without that split, madness was inevitable. Some drank themselves numb, others drowned in cocaine, but most of us perfected the art of emotional silence, just like we perfected the silence of our tongues. Inside the machinery, you did not live. You functioned. And like any machine, one broken gear could be replaced in an instant. The first crack in the council came in whispers. It was October 2011, and El Ingeniero arrived at a junta with charts, laptops, and a vision that looked more like Wall Street than Sinaloa. He spoke of modernizing everything, washing billions through international transfers, shell corporations, even cryptocurrencies no one in the room could pronounce. His plan was elegant, efficient, nearly untraceable. But to men raised in dust and blood, it sounded like a foreign language. Don Rafa slammed his hand on the table. "This man wants to turn us into a company of computers. We are men of land, of word, of respect." His voice carried the weight of tradition of opium fields stretching across mountains. To him, the future was planted in soil, not in screens. Even La Contadora, usually cool and pragmatic, showed caution. "Innovation attracts attention," she murmured to me once as I carried her documents. "When you move too fast, governments start to notice. Better to be a sheep than an eagle in this business." But El Ingeniero refused to yield. He began implementing his system quietly, using his network of lawyers and businessmen. Within 6 months, the plazas under his control reported profits tripling. The money flowed cleaner, faster, far. Yet with it came something no one wanted: the eyes of the United States Treasury, patterns of suspicious transactions, and investigators sniffing around. The breaking point came in March 2012. The council gathered in Mazatlan, the ocean rumbling outside the hotel suite. I stood guard at the door, but through the thin walls I heard history being written in raised voices. Your experiments are costing us everything, Don Rafa roared. My experiments, El Ingeniero snapped back, have given us more in 6 months than your dinosaur methods in 3 years. The room shook with fury. La Contadora tried to stitch a compromise. We can use both systems, the old for the heavy loads, the new for smaller flows. But El Ingeniero was absolute. No. Either we evolve or we die. For the first time, El Mayo himself intervened. His tone was calm but final. It will be done as Raphael says. The experiments stop until things settle. Silence followed. Then El Ingeniero said words that froze the air. With all respect, Ismael, that decision is a mistake, and I will not be part of it. The door opened minutes later, and I watched him walk out into the night, his face pale with defiance. That silence that lingered after he left, it was the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. A week later, the news spread inside the organization El Ingeniero. Had formed his own network, taking his financial roots and corporate contacts with him. El Padrino. The man sworn to protect us from law enforcement revealed his hand. He had been shielding Ingeniero's operations all along. La Contadora, ever the strategist, had been investing quietly in both sides, hedging her bets like any cautious banker. The council was no longer a table of consensus. It was a battlefield dressed in suits. The war that followed was not fought with convoys or gunfights in the streets. It was subtler, deadlier. In 3 months, 6 shipments vanished into DEA hands. Hotels linked to Ingeniero mysteriously burned. Restaurants and gas stations tied to Don Rafa faced sudden tax audits and closures. Each move was a message, each loss a strike. And in the middle of it, I carried envelopes, codes, warnings, pieces of a puzzle that made me a liability to everyone. Too many secrets rested in my hands. Too many sides watched me with suspicion. I began to understand when the machinery cracked, it did not just consume the bosses. It devoured everyone caught in the gears. By the summer of 2012, the council was no longer a council. It was a storm tearing itself apart, each gust threatening to pull me under. My position as part of the Mensajería Especial had once been an honor, but now it was a death sentence. Every delivery I made could be interpreted as betrayal. Every envelope I carried could be the one that tipped the balance toward one faction or another. The paranoia spread like wildfire. Men who had laughed together weeks before now refused to share a drink. Drivers disappeared on their way to meetings. Safe houses were raided not by the police, but by our own searching for leaks. I slept with my pistol under the pillow and a knife within reach, but no weapon could protect me from suspicion. The point of no return came in August. El Checo summoned me to a house in Culiacan. When I arrived, 3 unfamiliar men waited inside, each with the hard stare of veterans who had buried too many bodies. Checo's face was heavier than usual, his tone stripped of all pretense. "We have a problem," he said. "Information is leaking, and every trail points to your team." My blood turned to ice. "Jefe, I've never—" He cut me off with a raised hand. "I'm not accusing you. I'm warning you. There's a purge coming. You know what that means." I knew too well. Investigación was the word they used, but it meant torture until you confessed guilty or not. Once the suspicion reached your name, you were already dead. Checo looked at me with something almost human in his eyes. "You have 2 choices. Stay and face the investigation, or disappear tonight and never come back." It wasn't a choice. That night, I packed a small bag, false documents, a wad of pesos, the pistol that had become part of my body. I scribbled a note for my mother. "I have to travel for work. Don't know when I'll return." a lie to shield her from the truth I could never explain. I fled north. In Hermosillo, I stopped for gas and recognized the attendant, a halcon I had known years earlier. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and I knew my location would be reported before the pump finished ticking. I abandoned the car, stole a motorcycle, and rode through the night. Every truck in my mirror felt like a hunter, every siren a death knell. By dawn, I reached Nogales. The border loomed like salvation and damnation at once. For $500, coyotes moved me across without papers. 6 hours later, I was in Phoenix, Arizona, alive, undocumented, alone. The first months were the hardest. I washed dishes, hauled boxes, slept in rented rooms where nobody asked questions. But the paranoia followed me like a shadow. Every unknown number on my phone made my chest tighten. Every car that lingered too long outside felt like the cartel had finally caught my scent. News from home confirmed my fears. El Flaco, the veteran who once explained the council to me, was found dead. Officially, a settling of scores with the Zetas. Unofficially, everyone knew it was a purge. If they killed him with all his years of service, what chance did I ever have? I vanished again, this time to Denver. New name, new papers, new life. Construction by day, silence by night. No friends, no visits, no contact with my family. I became a ghost haunting my own existence. But ghosts carry memories, and mine were soaked in blood. I had escaped the purge, but I could never escape myself. Years have passed since that night I crossed the border, but the past has never loosened its grip. I live under a different name now in a city I will not name. By day, I am a construction worker, a husband, a father. By night, I am a prisoner of memories that no new life can erase. The hammer in my hands feels lighter than the gun I once carried, but the weight inside me has only grown heavier. People ask if it was worth it, those 8 years in the cartel. The money, the power, the revenge. My answer is simple: no. Money evaporates, power corrupts, and revenge doesn't heal. Carla is still gone. My mother still cries for the children she lost. And I still wake drenched in sweat, reliving the screams of those we interrogated, the faces of those I executed, the lies I told to mothers who waited for sons who would never return. But there is one thing those years gave me: knowledge. Bitter, dangerous, undeniable knowledge. I know that the cartels are not monsters in the shadows, nor lone kings to be dethroned. They are systems, economic, political, cultural. They thrive not because one man orders it, but because entire nations allow it. The first truth: drug trafficking is not a crime problem. It is an economic one. As long as there is demand in the United States, there will be supply in Mexico. Supply follows money like rivers follow gravity. Killing one capo, arresting another, only rearranges the flow. The second truth: corruption is not an exception. It is the system itself. El Padrino was no anomaly. He was the rule. Police soldiers, politicians. Some took money, others looked away, and he did both. The line between state and cartel was not a line at all. The third truth: cartels are corporations. They have accountants, human resources, logistics, research, and development. La Contadora was not a bookkeeper. She was a CFO managing billions. El Ingeniero was not a rogue visionary. He was an R&D director, building the future of illicit finance. They didn't operate like criminals. They operated like multinationals, with blood in their balance sheets. The fourth truth: violence is not chaos. It is a business tool. Every execution, every massacre, every mutilated body is a message calculated to produce a specific result. Fear, silence, compliance. Violence was not the goal. It was the advertisement. The fifth truth: The war on drugs is a lie. Every arrest, every headline, every historic capture strengthens the cartels by removing rivals and consolidating power. When they caught El Chapo, they didn't weaken the Pacific Cartel, they gave El Mayo more control. When they arrest El Mayo, the council will simply replace him. The machinery never stops. The sixth truth. This is not Mexico's problem alone. It is binational. The demand flows north, the blood spills south. Until both sides face their responsibility, nothing changes. And the seventh truth. The one that hurts the most is that cartels are not foreign bodies infecting Mexico. They are born of Mexico itself, poverty, inequality, institutions too weak to offer justice or hope. I did not join because I loved violence. I joined because in my neighborhood there was no other path that promised survival. And there are thousands like me still making that choice tonight. This confession is not redemption. It is not forgiveness. It is testimony. I cannot erase the blood on my hands. I cannot bring back the dead. But I can tear away the mask that hides the faces of those who still pull the strings from the shadows. You thought El Mayo was the boss. He was only the mask. The real bosses sit in rooms you will never see, signing papers, buying properties, deciding lives with the stroke of a pen. They do not carry guns. They do not run. They are invisible. And they are still there. So I speak now fully exposed for the first time in years, not to save myself, but to warn you the shadows endure because no one dares to look into them. If even one young man hears this and chooses another path, then perhaps my silence will finally mean something. Because after everything I have learned, one truth above all. You cannot defeat shadows with bullets. You can only defeat them with light.